All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today. We're really excited to talk about the process of applying for a Go-On in a Box kit, which you've been hearing about throughout this entire course, and for which we have an application open now. We'll be sharing a little bit more about what it is and how do you apply. So I'm joined here by my colleague Alexis at the Ocean Foundation. So we'll launch right into it. Next slide, please, Alexis. All right, so we have a couple different topics to cover today. So this is just a brief outline. We'll be giving a brief introduction to us at the Ocean Foundation, what we do, our motivation for doing this work to host these online trainings, as well as providing support and equipment like you're here today to learn about. We'll talk about what's in GOA-ON in a Box kits, what's included typically, and how we perhaps tailor that to different research ideas. We'll talk about the associated support that's available for kit recipients in addition to the equipment itself, provide some examples of how the Go-On in a Box kit has been used previously to carry out oceanification monitoring, and then go through a little bit of the process of applying for a Go-On in a Box kit. So who's eligible, what's required for the application form, and then what are the next steps after that. I'll turn it over to you, Alexis.
Thank you. So some of you may have heard about the Ocean Foundation in the past, but I figured I would introduce us as an organization since we are the ones who will be, facilitating the awarding of these kits. So the Ocean Foundation is a community foundation based in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And community foundation traditionally kind of raises funding in support of a community. Often you find that in a city, like New York City has a community foundation. Well, for us, our community is the ocean. And so we really focus on raising funding and providing administrative and project support to partners all over the world so that we can basically support all of our partners in achieving their research goals, their conservation goals, advocacy goals, whatever it is that they do. And so we do this in a whole bunch of different ways. Sometimes we provide administrative services, but we also operate three what we call core initiatives, meaning these are thematic areas where we have a long history of work and sort of a strategic plan. The one that this program sits under is our International Ocean Acidification Initiative, which is essentially as old as the organization itself. It's been a focus of the Ocean Foundation since its founding, but it largely focuses on building capacity in that we try and provide training and equipment as well as funding, technical support, all sorts of general support to help researchers reach their goals when it comes to ocean acidification monitoring, to help sort of bridge that technical chasm that often exists between a highly equipped lab, say in California, and a research group that might be just starting to look at ocean acidification. In this initiative, we also work with policymakers and help create legislation that will fund science at the national level, that also will help look at adaptation and mitigation techniques. And really importantly, we try and kind of strengthen that relationship between scientists and policymakers by helping, plan meetings collaboratively. So something to consider, as you think about the kit application is also how might you engage with management bodies or policymakers, and we're here to help you brainstorm how you might want to do that. Our two other core initiatives are the Blue Resilience Initiative, which is focused on coastal resilience and the natural resilience provided by ecosystems such as mangroves, coral, seagrasses. And again, this also focuses a lot on capacity development and helping local partners have access to the funding, the technical frameworks and help that they need to deliver really high quality coastal restorations, for example, to actually get blue carbon credits. And then finally, our third core initiative is the Redesigning Plastics Initiative, which focuses on redesigning the polymer science of plastics to really stop plastic pollution at the beginning, at the production standpoint. And it's looking at the chemistry as well as the politics and the policies behind plastics manufacturing. So that's just a little bit about the Ocean Foundation as a whole. Now, I talked about ocean acidification. This map shows where we have conducted some of our work before. And so this is where we've done training programs on policy, where we have provided kits, these go-on in a box kits in the past, where we've helped regional resolutions, meaning binding legal agreements to really strengthen regional collaboration on ocean acidification. And then finally, you see this one called peer-to-peer scholarship. That's a scholarship that we operate that allows mentors and mentees to work together on research goals and to help equip labs and kind of get the training that they need. And so you can see that there's a wide geographic diversity. And we have done a lot of work in the Pacific Islands in the past. We had a project here in 2017, 2018, 2019 is kind of the years that we were working, and included a training activity that I think Kaitlyn will tell you about. So this just gives you a sense of, what is this program that you would sort of be becoming a partner of should you receive a kit.
Exciting. And now we get to dive into a little bit more detail about what's in the Go-On in a Box kit and what it enables. As always, if you have any questions during these live sessions, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll have some time at the end where you can type them in the chat. We'll make sure we get to those too. But to share a little bit more about what you can do if you receive one of these kits, the main thing is really carrying out carbonate chemistry monitoring in the coastal environment. So through this course, we've learned about what is carbonate chemistry, the different parameters that you can measure, as well as what you do with that data, submitting it to the SDG 14.3.1 data portal. And that's really what this kit enables you to do. But there's also some other layers that you may consider adding on to your research plan, such as better understanding biological activity. We've heard from Sam and others how variable coral reef environments may be in terms of the metabolism of the organisms that are dominating that environment. So you can see here some of those instruments deployed in a coral reef, and there's a way to see and understand, what those changes may look like on a daily scale, on a seasonal scale, on a yearly scale. And then having this kit and especially the lab components of it, which I'll get into more detail in just a minute, really allows you to think about how to carry out biological experiments in the lab. So last week, Sam was talking about ways to set up a laboratory experiment and monitor it over time. And having this sort of equipment in the lab is one way to make sure that you have publishable quality data for those sorts of experiments, which is really exciting. But we're going to focus on the carbonate chemistry monitoring today. So next slide, Alexis. So there's a couple different research questions, or many different research questions that you can ask with this kit. And the application form asks you to develop a research plan of how you might envision using it. So as you think of different potential ways that fit in with the work that you are already doing now, whether you're perhaps monitoring fisheries or doing other sorts of water quality measurements, you might think about how you can use this kit to advance your larger set of research questions in your region. For example, you might be curious about the local rate of acidification. We sort of know how fast our global oceans are changing on the whole scale, but there's still a lot of work to be done to understand what it means on sort of a local or regional scale. And so providing this sort of monitoring can help us establish these local rates of change. Adrienne Sutton, during her Q&A session, talked about how long you might need to set up monitoring to see these sorts of changes over time. And so you can go back in and watch that for a little bit more detail, but that's one thing you might consider asking. As I mentioned earlier, we can think about how much variability coral reefs can create. So you could potentially think about deploying instruments in different areas around a coral reef and seeing how, as the water moves from the back reef or the fore reef across it, what that does to the signals in carbonate chemistry, and sort of understand how biology changes chemistry. You might be thinking about, running biological experiments down the line. And so what's really important is to have a baseline understanding of the sorts of conditions that those organisms experience, because they might be locally adapted to either high variations in conditions, or perhaps they sometimes see a relatively low pH. And so being able to understand that by having this equipment deployed is really beneficial towards further work in the future. Next slide, please. I think this is a really nice testimonial from one of our kit recipients, Carla Edworthy, who's in South Africa. She's been working with the kit for a couple of years now and has had some really neat projects to to contribute to her graduate research and now beyond. And she says, without the kit, I wouldn't have had the funding or research capacity to do my work. And in the next slide, we'll see an example of Dr. Katie Sawapi, who you're familiar with, and the work that she's been doing along with her colleagues at the University of the South Pacific to use the kit in a way to monitor mangrove environments. So they received their kit in 2018 and deployed it at a site of mangrove restoration. They're still working on quality controlling that data to upload it to the SDG 14.3.1 data portal. But on this figure here, you can see temperature measurements from the instrument that's included, as well as pH measured from an ISAMI, which is one of the instruments that we'll talk about, and look at just how dynamic this sort of environment is. So being able to deploy these sorts of sensors using the GOA-ON in a box kit really gives us great insight into local conditions and how frequently they're changing. Next slide, please. So what's included with receiving a GOA-ON in a box kit after you apply and potentially are awarded one of these neat opportunities? Of course, it's the equipment that goes along with it. And so we'll go into a little bit of the field and the lab equipment that becomes part of the kit. We'll discuss a little bit of the training that complements that, and then the extra support as well for those kit recipients. Next slide, please. So there's within the kit a suite of equipment that includes field instruments. So this is just a couple of images of those. There's materials to take bottle samples to then bring them back to the lab and measure. So a Niskin bottle to collect a sample of water at depth, or near the surface, just a way to sort of get a nice sample and bring that back to measure later. There's also some sensors that are included, including this ISAMI pH sensor, which is a really neat way to measure pH out in the environment. It uses a spectrophotometric process to measure the pH. So there isn't, challenges with using an electrode for measuring pH either. So it's a really nice instrument that you can deploy out in the field and get those sorts of, long-term measurements of how the pH is changing on a relatively fine time scale. And then the CTD diver is, it's named conductivity, temperature, and depth. And so you can have associated variables. As we learned, before, you can't just measure 2 parameters in the field. You also have to measure salinity and temperature and the pressure as well. That's important for being able to calculate the full carbonate chemistry system later on. Next slide, please.
Yes, and we actually, Kaitlyn, we've got a good question in the chat that I think you can kind of weave in. It was just sent to me, so I'll read it for you. Asking, I wonder if I can use the kit as well to determine and compare ocean acidification rates from blue carbon sinks, such as mangrove, seagrass, and salt marsh. So maybe, I don't know, Kaitlyn, if you want to weave that into what you're talking about now, but I think it's a very good question.
That is really interesting. I think there's a couple different ways to look at carbon sinks. Certainly measuring the water around these sorts of environments is really important for understanding just the dynamics themselves. So Katie was seeing, what are sort of the conditions around this mangrove restoration site to get an understanding of how those, just what the seasonal and daily timescales are. There's also options for collecting samples in mangrove habitats to look at the sediment and understand the organic material that's being stored over a longer sort of timescale. So the kit may become part of your set of tools to then study these sorts of environments and understand blue carbon. Do you have anything else you want to add, Alexis?
Yeah, I think that the truth is to really quantify the carbon sink is a bit of an undertaking because you would want to be doing soil chemistry as well as seawater chemistry likely. That said, some information is better than none. And if this is what you're interested in, we could consult with you and think about the best research design that would enable to use the kit. Because as Kaitlyn will get into, the kit is good for monitoring in one or a few locations, but you don't have so much that you can really do a really large scale monitoring program. But if you could do really regular bottle sampling, as well as deployments of sensors kind of in a way where you capture that variability, you might be able to draw some initial conclusions, for example, about the variability of the carbonate chemistry in those different ecosystems. To actually quantify the sink and the rate would take more time. But again, there's sort of like, there's always a starting point and always sort of an initial set of research questions you can answer with your first set of data. And the thing is, if you receive the kit, you'll be working collaboratively with not only us, but a mentor who will be assigned to you, who can help you kind of figure out, okay, well, what research question can I really answer with this data, or what data should I collect to answer my research question? So short answer is it will help get to that answer. I don't think it's necessarily sufficient to really answer that question in full, because you'd probably want to add soil chemistry work and a few other things, but you would be able to capture the variability of the ecosystems, I'd say.
Mhm. Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that it speaks to the fact that there's so many different components of the ocean carbonate chemistry system. You know, for myself, my experiences as a biologist, I was running these sorts of biological experiments in the lab, but in order to do so, I really needed to understand the conditions that the organisms experience. And so there is that sort of initial work of going out in the field and taking these sorts of samples, going back to the lab and learning how to do the chemistry properly in order to understand it. And so as we think about, you know, what would make a good application, that ability to think about the long-term picture, you know, is beneficial. You know, we hope that these kits will be used for many years to come to provide strong data. But so one way you might think about that is maybe sort of phases that you're interested in. You're just doing the monitoring to understand the conditions. And then as that becomes more routine and more data is known, there's these additional layers that can build off of that to create a fuller understanding of the environment and what's going on. So get back to the slides. We discussed the equipment that you can use in the field, including, you know, that Niskin bottle to take a sample of seawater and bring it back to the lab. So that's done by using a special glass bottle, which is included in the kit and sealed up really well and made stable. So they can be then measured back in the lab, you know, relatively quickly, or, you know, safely stored in the lab for, you know, a period of time, like up to a year or maybe even longer. So that includes measurement tools to measure total alkalinity, which we're familiar with, using titration approaches and a multimeter and a pH probe to understand those values. We have an approach to measure pH in the lab using a spectrophotometric approach again. And so these are sort of the ways that we then get those two carbonate chemistry system parameters, then calculate the rest of the system itself. But there's also some other miscellaneous supplies that includes a computer to process and store all the data, some, you know, small components like tubing, O-rings in the equipment, nuts and bolts, et cetera, to really round out the full kit. You know, you might even take a look at the bottle right here and see that it has a little rubber band that is clamping the glass bottle closed. And so we include small components like that to make sure that, you know, there's nothing that's hindering the research that could be going on with this kit. Next slide, please. All right, so we covered the equipment that's covered in a GOA-ON in a box kit. And the second aspect that's provided for kit recipients is some hands-on training. So you might recognize some of the faces in these pictures here. You know, Dr. Kim Curry, who joined us for the Pacific Islands Network and Support live session. Dr. Chris Sabine down there in the bottom corner from Module 2. Dr. Katie Sawapi right there. And so these are just some images from some of the past hands-on trainings that we've held. So prior to receiving your kit, we are going to plan this training at the Pacific Islands Oceanification Center in Suva, Fiji, to bring everyone together and have the opportunity to learn how to use all of the equipment. So there's some time over this multi-day period to go out in the field and learn how to deploy sensors properly, and then plenty of time back in the lab to learn how to do these titrations, learn how to do the spectrophotometric measurements, and then, you know, how to begin to process that sort of data, to discuss your research plans and hone them, and hear from some of the experts that we're bringing in on their best practices. So after these sorts of trainings, there's, you know, the expectation that you'll have full confidence in going back to your institution and being able to use the kit to its full potential. Next slide. And this is just to show that, the Ocean Foundation, as Alexis has shared, has done a number of these sorts of hands-on trainings, bringing experts and new kit recipients together in many different locations with many different size groups too. For these sorts of hands-on trainings, we try to keep them relatively small so that you have the opportunity to practice on the equipment and ensure that you have the adequate experience and confidence necessary to go forth. Next slide, please.
All right, so I think this might be where I take over, Kaitlyn, is that right? Great. Okay, so in addition to the actual equipment, which Kaitlyn gave a great rundown of, and then the in-person training support, there's additional support that we provide for kit recipients. We provide a research stipend designated for the scientists who will be doing the work with the instruments. There is a brand new thing through this program at the Pacific Islands OA Center. There will be a spare parts inventory. So this is key if, some of these items are manufactured in the United States. They can take a while to order and get in country if they break. And so having a more local area with spare parts in a place like Suva that people frequently travel through for work, or maybe your colleagues will be traveling through, there will be a process to request replacement parts. And then that could be shipped to you from Suva, or if you or someone you know is going to be flying through Suva, they can pick it up and bring it back. And so that would be things like glassware that might break more easily, reagents or other things that you might run out of. We also will, we're going to work to establish a regional secondary standard. So the idea being to help you know that the results that you're getting are good, that your analyses, that then you can trust your numbers. We'll also house that at the PIOAC, and that will be available in Suva. There will be staff at the PIOAC. You've heard from Katie. There's a few other staff members who will be providing data management support, as well as support if you need tips and tricks when you're working with your systems. There's also going to be 2 practice systems at the PIOAC. And so should you really feel like you need a little bit more training, or let's say you have staff turnover and you get a new research assistant or a new graduate student, or anything like that, you can apply to receive a grant to travel to the PIOAC and receive a little bit more of that hands-on training in the center. Additionally, there are community networks. The OA Info Exchange, which you heard about a few weeks ago, is this wonderful online forum where you can ask questions. I'm getting these numbers and I don't understand them. Or, the question that Tlian had about the different ecosystems and how to monitor them. That's a great place to ask that kind of question and ask for the best methods, and people will kind of respond to you. And then of course, PITOA is the regional hub of GOA-ON that, again, you heard about a few weeks ago, and that is a wonderful network of like-minded individuals in the region doing this work. So with this equipment, there are some eligibility requirements, and a lot of this is set by our funder. We receive our funding support from the US government, from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration and the US Department of State. And so we request that applicants successfully complete all 7 modules of the course. This is really just to show your interest in the subject and that you've kind of put the first steps towards learning about ocean acidification. We know there have been some challenges with quiz completion, and so we encourage you to reach out directly to us because we likely will be able to offer some sort of waiver or extension. We're working with the Ocean Teacher Global Academy right now, and I think we'll actually be able to move some of those deadlines. So please don't fret if you've missed a quiz because of internet connectivity issues. Please write to us, because really it's just that you've gone through the material that's important to us in terms of eligibility. Now, the kits are formally given to institutions because the idea is that it will live at an institution for years to come. And so to apply for a kit, you need to be formally affiliated with an institution that's capable of housing and maintaining the kit. That could be at a university, it could be a government office, it could be an NGO, as long as it has the sufficient space to be able to house and operate a kit. And then we ask that you be a graduate student or more senior. So someone who's affiliated and will be there for a few years at least, because it really takes a couple of years to get that data, to really get to the data quality control to the point that you're really confident in it. If you have any questions about what all this means, please feel free to reach out to me and Kaitlyn, and we're happy to answer questions. And then the final requirement is location. So there's a list of countries that we were given by our funder as the priority countries. Additionally, we are receiving some support through the Commonwealth Blue Charter, and it is very likely that we will be able to support any successful applicant from a Commonwealth country. So if the country you are based in is not in this list, but you are from a Commonwealth country, then please apply. If you have any questions about eligibility, please let us know. I see a question from Sharon about how many kits per country. This is something that in the past, we were asked to only give 1 kit per country. And I think this year we will likely remove that, and it will be solely based on the quality of the applications. And I'll actually get into I'll get into it in a second. I'll show you the requirements. As far as the lab space, you don't need a ton of lab space. Basically, like a bench of lab space is plenty. What you have is a spectrophotometer that's like this big, like as big as your upper body, kind of, maybe. And that's the biggest piece of equipment, really. And then there's a multimeter, which is sort of this like electronics box that measures the current. And you have a ring stand and a stir plate. So you really only need like 5 feet of table space to set this all up. Now, sometimes it can be nice to have more space if you have a lot of bottle samples, right, that you need to store before you get to run your samples. Or, you might want to have some space to be able to take apart the sensor and do repairs and things like that. But it's not like, this is not aquariums. This is really just to do the bottle analysis, right? So you just need enough space to analyze bottles one at a time. And then, what I think would be really useful probably is for everyone, we actually have these videos that we created that show Dr. Chris Devine using the kit and walking through how to do each thing. That'll give you a really good idea of what exactly is in it. And those are on YouTube, and Kaitlyn can share those with you. I think they're also in the syllabus, or perhaps I don't remember if we shared them yet, but we'll make sure those are available. So moving on, and then I'll keep asking questions in the chat, and I'll try to answer them as I go. So the deadline for the application is May 13th, to try and give everyone about a month after the course wraps up. And this application is a Google form. I believe Kaitlyn created a downloadable version so you can work offline and kind of prepare your application before. And what we're asking for is, what's your background? What's your institution that you're applying from? What's your background as you and your research team? What are you trying to understand? What are your research questions? Are you trying to establish the first monitoring? And are you working in a marine protected area? Are you interested in looking at a place where there's a lot of, maybe pearl farming, and you're wanting to understand the variability in this critical economic ecosystem? Are you looking at this question of, calcification rates in reefs and trying to understand that? Are you looking in seagrasses? All great research questions. Gives you an opportunity to just talk about what you hope to do. And then talk about the institutional resources available. So this is things like making sure that this kit will really be used, for years to come, and making sure that the institution is excited to support you in doing this research. A data management plan and outreach plan, just to basically say, how will you share your findings and how will you upload your data, and then CVs of the research team. Now, how will we score these? I'd say there's kind of 2 broad categories that will come into play when a selection is made. The selection will be made by the advisory committee of our project. So this is made up of our funders, as well as members of the GOA-ON Executive Council, and then representatives from regional stakeholder groups. Of course, if anyone is involved with an application, they will not take place in the evaluation. So we'll make sure there's no conflict of interest there. So the first thing we'll be looking at is project sustainability. How likely is it that this project will succeed into the future in terms of, is the institution really supportive of using this? Is there a plan for how to maintain this equipment long term and really integrate this equipment into the institution? What about training new users, right? If there are new users that come along, is there a good plan for that and for managing the data? And then the second component I would say is the research quality. What are the qualifications of the staff, and what training experience that do they have? And also I would say part of this is interest, because we understand that you're new maybe to this topic. And so the expectation is not that you know everything, but that you're interested in learning and that you've demonstrated that you're interested. And then importantly, is the proposed research appropriate in scope for the items in the kit? Will it fill a current research gap? So this is really, have you thought through what research you want to accomplish, how you'll use the kit? I wish I could tell you exactly how many kits will be awarded. I would say a minimum of 5 are expected to be awarded in the region. We might be getting a donation of some additional equipment, and we're trying to sort out how to fit that all in. It's possible that rather than increasing the number of kits, we're going to provide more equipment per kit to try and really make them as robust as possible. But minimum of 5 kits total, so 5 kits across the region. So each kit has a value of $20,000 US before shipping, and that doesn't include the maintenance parts and the training. So it's 5 kits, and keep in mind that with a kit, you might only have 1 set of sensors or perhaps 2 set of sensors, depending on how we build out these kits, but you have a number of bottles. And the beauty of bottle sampling is that as long as you have sufficient bottles and you've got a schedule for when you'll run your analyses, you can have multiple sites that you're monitoring. As long as you are collecting the samples on a regular schedule and analyzing them so you can reuse the bottles. So, we've had kit recipients be able to have multiple sampling sites, for example, with 1 kit. Or the other thing, and we'll get into this in a second, is that we actually work directly with the kit recipients to customize their kits. So if you say, I'm really interested in trying to have as many sampling sites as possible, but I already have a spectrophotometer, then we say, great, that's a cost savings. We don't need to buy a spectrophotometer. We're going to buy way more sample bottles and make sure you have that, so that we can get into the kind of customizing. So yeah, this is what happens next, right? So after participants are selected, the TOF staff will work with the recipients to tailor the equipment. We have sort of a checklist of what's typically included, and what we do is we tend to we talk about what are your research goals, right? So how can we make sure that it will help you reach your research goals? And then therefore, do we need to modify the kit? For example, include more sample bottles. Now, of course, there's a limited amount of funding in the pot, so sometimes we look to see where are there cost savings if the institution already has certain equipment. That say, like if you already have a stir plate or you already have ring stands, then we don't need to purchase those, and then we can purchase more other items. And then the Ocean Foundation handles all of the customs clearance and shipping. And then we're going to try and time the hands-on training so that it happens basically just after or like immediately around when you get your equipment, so that everything is super fresh, so that when you get your equipment, you get the training and then you're immediately setting up your lab. You'll also, as we said, receive a research stipend. It's $7,500 per institution. And then you begin your research. And of course, it doesn't end there. I will say there are kit recipients I've worked with for 6 years and counting, who I'm still in touch with all the time, and we're talking about what they're up to. And so even though our program is just a 3-year program that we have funding for here at the Ocean Foundation, we don't stop after the end of our program. We're very interested in helping you long-term. And even more than us, the PIOAC has been founded, and their goal is to continue in perpetuity and really to be there as a resource for you in SUVA, led within the region. So that's the kind of presentation from us. I will go to a summary slide so you can sort of see the general gist, but I see that I've tried to answer questions as we've gone, but please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, ask a question, or continue to type in the chat if you prefer to do that.
Perhaps while folks are thinking of their questions, we can share a little bit about the history of our work in the Pacific Islands and what countries are using GOA-ON in a box kits right now.
That's a great idea. So we co-hosted a workshop with SPREP in 2017 at the University of the South Pacific in Suva. And we had 2 weeks of workshops. So the first week was a bit more of a general training workshop, kind of like the online course, but concentrated in 1 week in person, where we had scientists from most of those countries that you saw, a similar list of countries, attend. We also invited policymakers and management officials to kind of talk about the legislative approaches to addressing ocean acidification. We then had a second week of training with a smaller group who were the kit recipients that we'd already selected. And in that training, they had an opportunity to practice using the equipment to look at the data. We actually did a deployment in Suva Harbor and we looked at the data. We took bottle samples when we did the deployment. We got really great agreement between our bottle samples and the sensor data. It was wonderful. And then we customized the kits and shipped them out. And so the kits went to, there's one kit at the University of South Pacific Suva. There's one at the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu. There's one in Tokelau, one in Tuvalu, one in Papua New Guinea, and one in Palau, and one at the National University of Samoa. If you are interested in talking to any of the existing kit recipients, we'd be happy to put you in touch. We have a couple questions in the chat. So can the kit be used together with other projects? Absolutely. The beautiful thing about this kit is that it includes so much equipment that is really able to be used for multiple purposes. A spectrophotometer with the right reagents can measure so many different things. And so we absolutely support you leveraging this equipment to answer your research goals. I also think that adding the carbonate chemistry understanding to any existing research project just really strengthens your understanding of the system. So maybe you already have a temperature monitoring program or a nutrient monitoring program. And so that is an example of where this kit could really enhance your ability. We have a question about our, oh, go ahead, Kaitlyn.
I'll also add, there is sort of like a cyclical nature to this work, right? If you really wanted to, you could go out every single day and take bottle samples, bring them to the lab and measure those constantly if you're really excited about understanding the carbonate chemistry. But with the sensors that we have, it's something that can be deployed on a periodic basis. So you might find a good location where the sensor is secure and leave it out for a period of a few months potentially before you need to bring it back to the lab and collect the data, add new reagents, et cetera, and service it. So this is something that can be sort of potentially fit around the research projects that you have right now and may take, a couple of days here and there, a couple of months to turn around. But there's the chance to, sort of fit that in with your other projects too and add on a new plan.
Absolutely. Question from Wycliffe about any papers where the kits are being used. So I would say that the kits are new enough that the first set of papers are just kind of in review right now. I think Carla is the closest to publishing a paper, our kit recipient in South Africa. There's been lots of presentations at conferences with kit data. So I've seen certainly Carla and I think Demboya from Mozambique has presented. Katie has some data from her mangrove work and others. So I don't know, I'll let you know as soon as a paper is published with this information, but it's sort of, we're just at that phase where publications are starting to take place. Marion has a really good question about the kit at the Vanuatu campus, malfunctions with the instruments. So in recognition that some equipment breaks and we need to make sure there's sustainability, that's why we created this spare parts inventory. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have an inventory of all the pieces that commonly break, and they will be available to existing kit recipients and new kit recipients. There'll be a process to request items, but it's no cost to you. It'll be, we'll try and have at least $30,000 worth of equipment kind of stockpiled, if you will, knowing what often breaks, and making sure that we have ready replacements for you. I think also there's a lot of troubleshooting that can be done, and we try to be supportive in terms of providing like the ocean acidification info exchange, or like, for example, when people have issues with the sensor, we often put them directly in touch with the developer of the sensor to help troubleshoot them. The reality is that the more kind of technical the equipment, the more difficult it is to troubleshoot. So the sensors can be challenging to work with, but we're going to do everything that we can to provide the support. And I'd say the PIOAC, we're really optimistic. They're going to be actually presenting at the Our Ocean conference in Palau in a couple of weeks, and we're hoping that they might be able to secure some funding for the PIOAC to kind of continue purchasing equipment to be these spare parts, to continue to have more in-country and in-region support for everybody. Kaitlyn, do you want to take this question from Wycliffe about where to deploy and collect samples?
Mm-hmm. That's something we're going to be talking about in a little bit more detail during the live Q&A session this week with Dr. Adrienne Sutton, and Dr. Sophie Chu is joining us as well. It really depends on your research questions. So there is sort of a depth limit for the sensors. The ICME can't go further than a couple of meters down. Can't withstand the pressure of something that's really well below the surface. But within that, there's some flexibility to meet your research plans. So you might choose to deploy near one of these mangrove sites and understand the dynamics around these photosynthetic organisms. You might choose to have questions around coral reefs. Perhaps you're interested in learning about the dynamics there, or what the corals are doing. But there might also be questions around other environments where there's important species of fish potentially. So it really depends on what you're interested in to choose that best site. Where there's more organisms like coral reefs, there's probably going to be more factors that are contributing to the carbonate chemistry and making it a little bit more difficult to interpret. Corals changing the chemistry through calcification and dissolution, but also the photosynthetic organisms like coral are also changing the carbonate chemistry on that sort of basis as well. So you might potentially choose a less interesting site, where it's just a lot of sand to really understand the coastal dynamics, and see if there's any influence of currents or seasonality, water temperature influences. So whether you're, I guess, more of a biologically minded person or someone who's just more interested in the bulk chemistry, that can determine where you might best want to site your equipment. And of course, potential
Absolutely.
for interaction with other industries as well. If it's near a fishing spot, you might want to consider someone bumping into your equipment and the risk of that, versus something that's a little bit farther away, but maybe it takes you a bit longer to go collect and service.
Something that we also find is that sometimes you don't know how often you need to sample until you understand the variability. So we often recommend that you do a deployment of the continuous monitoring, the sensors, and then you capture that variability, and then that will help you determine how frequently you need to collect bottle samples in order to understand the system that you're trying to understand. And sometimes it's better to start a little simpler. We've found that, like Kaitlyn said, sometimes if you can go in like a marine protected area where there's less, influences of other things, or if there's an area with a little less variability, might be a little easier to start. That said, there are protocols for doing this. There's some protocols for how to study calcification rates of corals by having sort of like a transect, if you will, with a distance from the reefs, and you can kind of look at the carbonate system and try to make some assessments there. But the more complex your question, the harder it is to interpret, or the more data you have to collect and all these various things. For Maisie asked, do all members of the research team have to take the OA course? I suggest that at minimum, one person needs to complete it, and they would be the lead person. Application will be stronger if multiple research team members have completed the course, but it's not a requirement because there will be additional training provided. We got a message from Marianne about the equipment. Marianne, I would suggest send a list and an explanation to myself and Kaitlyn. And then what we'll do is we'll make sure that when we're ordering the equipment for the spare parts inventory, that we include the items that need replacement. And that will also be really helpful information for us to know kind of what challenges people are facing. So we know, how much of everything to order.
Mhm. Yeah, just to reiterate, that email address that's on the screen, ioai@oceanfoundation.org, goes to both myself and Alexis. So you can reach us both at that email address.
And this Q&A is really just to help kick off this process. The applications aren't due for another 6 weeks or so, and we're available to, if you want to bounce ideas off of us in terms of you're trying to decide what the best research plan is, or you have questions, just let us know. We want you to be successful. So we're here. Well, fantastic. I think all your questions have been amazing. And I'm really excited to see everyone's proposals, and I hope we can award everyone equipment. I don't know how many proposals there will be yet, but I'm really looking forward to being able to work with all of you, and hopefully we'll be able to deliver equipment and have an in-person training together and support your research.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Kaitlyn and I will linger in case anyone has any lingering questions, but feel free to sign off if you have no questions.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm from Solomon Islands. I work at the Solomon Islands Meteorological Service, and one of our responsibilities is providing ocean services. Currently, ocean acidification is not included in the ocean services we provided for the public. However, we are planning to do that in the future, but we don't know where and how to start. In the Solomon Islands, we have the University of the South Pacific and as well as the Solomon Islands University. We are planning to work collaboratively with them so that we can able to work together and able to measure the ocean acidification in our waters. And I do hope that from this training, we can able to start our measurements.
I think so. I think that, that you already have an ocean monitoring network of some kind. You can look at, something you can look at is what research stations do you have? Are you already collecting samples? Maybe you can add another sample collection to that. And Dr. Katie Sawapi is from the Solomon Islands originally. I'm not sure if you know her, but she grew up there. She lives in Fiji now, but she's very passionate about, she's a very smart woman, brilliant scientist, but also very passionate about making sure that there's ocean acidification research in the Solomon Islands. So I would also consider reaching out to her because she might have some ideas, because she has some experience with ocean acidification and of course her home.
Yeah, I talked with her a few weeks ago, and she told me that it has never been, ocean acidification has never been monitored here in the Solomons. So
yeah, I think starting with a list of what do you have already? Because for example, if you're going to do sample collection, it's great if you don't have to take a separate boat trip, right? If you can just do it all in one go, or if you have community partners. Some people work with community partners to do the sampling. There's a little bit of training you want to do to make sure that the partners are collecting the samples appropriately, but that works really well in some places. Or you can just pick the site nearest to the university or nearest to your station to begin with and just start there and start with something that you can get to from the shore or really easily. And that could be a place to start. And you could say that will be the initial research station, and then we will expand to additional stations, you know, as we build our capacity. That's another thing that you could decide.
Okay. I will get more information from you later.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll put our email in the chat again.
Anyone else have any questions? We're happy to stick around. Well, again, our email's in the chat, and we've got about, I think, 6 weeks until applications are due. So feel free to email us. And of course, the course still has a little bit longer to go, so you'll get some great information as we wrap up the course.
Yes. Great. So our next event coming up is the Q&A session for this week on Friday at noon Fiji time, as I mentioned, with Dr. Adrienne Sutton and Dr. Sophie Chu to discuss chemical observations in the field. So it perfectly aligns with this. You can think about how to deploy instruments, find the best sites, you know, what are some examples of other work that's done in the field to measure these sorts of parameters, and continue the conversation as well.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.